Hi, my name is Steve Ross, and this is the Steve Ross Show. Thanks for joining me. For this week's show, I'm changing things up a little bit. Recent events involving violence between police and the public, especially African American men who have lost their lives while never being even so much as charged with anything, it's got me thinking about a whole lot of things. So this show, I'm interviewing Brad Watkins with the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center. I talked to him last week about the situation in Ferguson and local efforts to highlight the gulf between the police and, in many cases, police policy here in Memphis and the public. Now, like I said, instances of problems between police and the public have been moving faster than my production setup can keep up with. I've been struggling to keep up with the ongoing events in the wake of the grand jury decision in New York and the protests that have arisen since. My thought is that anything I might have said before that grand jury decision is dated and demands that I update it. The world is different today than it was yesterday, and much can be the same of what happened in the past couple of weeks. With that in mind, I want to get right to the first part of my interview with Brad Watkins. So I'm here with Brad Watkins from the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center, and it's good to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Really excited to be here.
I want to start with, kind of what was your reaction to the grand jury decision last week that kind of sparked this most recent bit of activism?
Well, my personal reaction was one of disgust and disappointment, but sadly it wasn't surprise. So this case, the Brown case, and many other cases are kind of indicative of a lot of problems with our criminal justice system, especially as it relates to issues of class, issues of gender, and most pronouncedly with people of color. But it's much bigger than the Brown case and with the incidents in Ferguson. We're talking about a national problem with the militarization of our police force, a national problem with disparities in our criminal justice system. And so what we're seeing here is a lot of people who see their experiences echoed in the experiences of the people of Ferguson, from the ham-handed response to law enforcement to this kind of occupation tactics of law enforcement. And people are seeing their daily reality reflected in that. And so they're taking action. There have been a number of protests just here this past week. And a lot of new groups, a lot of new individuals, the Mid-South Youth Collective, in partnership with Enough is Enough Memphis, and organized that protest just last week at Poplar and Highland. Ironically, all the store owners, the shops right there from Spin Street, Party City, a number of others closed. Now, originally, we had thought that this was the business owners giving in to fear-mongering, but actually we found out later that MPD had gone by and suggested to these stores that they close. Now, this was a completely nonviolent protest. The organizers of this event were very clear in putting that message out there. They even went and complied with the city and got a permit. And yet, at the same time, these fear-mongering tactics are used against anyone who has any kind of dissent on any level. So there's been all these calls for people to be nonviolent, all these calls for people to be calm. But there comes a point where the police department telling people to be calm and having overtime shifts and warning people to stay within the law becomes a threat. And in the end creates the kind of environment where bad things can happen rather than diffuse the situation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that instance where the police actually suggested to the shop owners or the managers there to shut down was kind of one of the most egregious kinds of overstepping of things. I mean, I think it's one thing to tell them, hey, this is happening on your corner. It's another thing to say, you might not want to be here for this, because it gives the perception that any kind of organized action to raise people's awareness, or just speak out in opposition to or in or for something is somehow a bad thing. It's somehow a threat to to daily life.
To daily life.
And it's really interesting to me that those are the foundations of our republic. How does that increase the difficulty of getting a message out on any issue, but particularly an issue where there might be a good deal of misunderstanding because of people's class differences or race differences or just differences of experience, like this, where there's a lot of kind of emotions involved?
I would say there's even a greater danger, and that danger is you create a greater gulf between the community and the police department. And the police department has itself to blame for that. The fact is that there are protests at that intersection. Anyone who lives in Memphis knows that Poplar and Highland is a popular spot for protests. There was a protest there just this weekend. Most of the protests in town, many groups use that space. What I'm saying is, why is this the first time that MPD has gone to tell businesses that they might want to close early? And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is one of the rare cases where you had a large number of young African Americans protesting on that corner. You have young European Americans protesting at that intersection all the time. Like I said, just this past weekend, there was no MPD presence at all, and no stores were being encouraged to close. I mean, there's a clear and undeniable racial dynamic to those actions, and we feel it's fear-mongering and wrong. And instead of making the public afraid of our young people, those young people who organized a protest of hundreds of people in a short period of time should be lifted up and commended for that, and the fact that they were the ones who held order there. So again, the police department and police departments across the country kind of want to have it both ways. On one hand, they want to constantly appeal to the public to trust them, but at the same time, they behave in a manner where they don't trust the public at all. As I said before, these young people got a permit. They remained within the area of the permit. They didn't block traffic. They were completely nonviolent. They stayed within they did everything asked of them, and still you have fear tactics being used by the police department to attempt to marginalize their message. So you asked about how does that make things difficult to get messages out. That is by design. Right. That's the reason why it happened. Otherwise, there's no logical reason for that to have happened at all. And it's really disappointing.
So, you have an example here of a group of people who did everything right. They went, they got the permit, they talked to the police, they stayed within their boundaries of the protest permit, and yet it still kind of worked against them. And even in a city with a predominantly African American group, African American population with a lot of leadership who are African Americans, it still seems like there's a lack of understanding that kind of certain people get treated differently by the police or by authority figures in general. And so, I guess my question is, what do you think is really behind that whole thing? We've kind of talked around it, but it seems like it's not just here. It's, when I was a kid in North Little Rock, there were kids in my neighborhood who got picked on a lot more than I did, and it became pretty clear in a pretty short order why that was. So what do you think is driving this kind of, like you said, fear-mongering, and I think that's spot on when it comes to any kind of, trying to do anything that might challenge the established order?
Well, and you hit it on the nail on the head right there. It's all about maintaining control, but there's also a deep raising of consciousness that needs to happen in this community as far as the fear-mongering and as far as how we view young black men and young black women. And the fact is that you had one incident at Kroger, which has sparked tons of fear-mongering and all of this new youth violence plan. On the other hand, you had 10 times that many number of young people who had a nonviolent protest just a short distance away. And yet a intellectually honest person, an intellectually honest administration would take that as a need to reevaluate some positions we have on young thugs.
Right.
There were 10 times that many nonviolent protesters who were there, completely peaceful, who were young people, versus a much smaller group at that Kroger action. Yet we're changing city policy for that smaller group. And so I guess it begs the question of, we are an organization that is committed to nonviolence. Not only nonviolence, as I am personally committed to tactical nonviolence, but we as an organization are also committed to a nonviolent society and doing the internal work of nonviolence. However, but it is the violence, the systemic violence that's being committed every day against people in this city that we are called to condemn. The systemic violence of stigmatizing young men and women, the systemic violence of Blue Crush, which it takes a law enforcement strategy and turns it into an occupation strategy. The systemic violence of our criminal justice system, of our inadequate bus system, of our defunded schools, of our neighborhoods where blight's been allowed to take hold. Those are all forms of violence as well, and they're being perpetrated against the poorest of the poor in this city every single day. And yet, when I hear all these calls for peace and nonviolence, what many in this community are mistakenly calling for is what Dr. King referred to as a negative peace. And so we as an organization cannot support calling people who are the victims of violence to chastise them and talk to them like children about nonviolence, when so far there hasn't been a violent protest in this city in over 20 years.
I was reading something a couple of months ago, and it was actually almost a month away from the Michael Brown shooting. And it reported that in that month, there had been 21 incidents of young African-American males being shot by police. It seems like a really high number. Now that's nationwide, that's not obviously this is another kind of violence perpetrated on kind of a group of people that's been largely marginalized. But with all the other things that African American men have to deal with in society, it just seems like that the reality for African American men is very difficult in this world, the world that we've kind of set up, where they're pigeonholed as, that video, you talked about the Kroger thing, that video of the one kid who was doing something awful, right? But it got played over and over and over again. And it seems to me that was not so much about reporting what was going on, but rather perpetuating this idea that African American men are inherently violent.
Well, it's also challenging. You hear about it in the workplace and in all sorts of environments that, there's a zone in which you and I could go to an event or a restaurant or
right.
a bank and have a problem with our service or whatever, and you're perfectly within your rights to have a problem with that. I am too, but only if I'm in the nicest tone of voice. If I raise my voice, then the idea is that I'm going to instantly become aggressive, that I'm instantly going to be violent.
Right.
And I think that is not just a perception that plays into our media roles and certain social interactions in our society, but then those values and norms and ideas become hardwired into our institutions, like our law enforcement system. So when we talk about MPD or we talk about police forces, it's important that people understand that institutions, that good people work for all sorts of horrible institutions all the time, all over the world. But institutions do not change of their own accord. Institutions do not change because good people get put in charge of them. Institutions have a directive and almost kind of an institutional will of their own. And so it's important that in this conversation and in the wake of Ferguson and in the wake of this kind of national call to action around issues of police accountability and criminal justice reform, which are all long overdue.
Sure.
That we understand that this is about dismantling and reforming institutions so that they actually work for all citizens, and that we have to focus on that institutional level, on the systemic level, on that level that affects millions of people across this country just through their daily existence. So that, I think that's a really important distinction. But yeah, it's it is frustrating when there are things that make you angry in life, but to actually have a human emotion or human reaction to anger now makes you a suspect.
Right. It just seems like such a huge hurdle.
Well, and it's not, I mean, it's and similar in our society with issues of patriarchy and sexism, that
Sure.
women are assumed to be hysterical
Right.
or irrational off the cuff or things like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of problems in
Sure.
our consciousness here in America, and that isn't separate from our laws and government. One bleeds into the other.
I'll have part 2 of my interview with Brad Watkins in the next episode. Now, the events of the past couple of weeks have been very challenging for me. It seems like there's been one tragedy after another dominating the headlines. Each tragedy has exposed another unhealed wound on the body of the American public. In the process, I've been trying to craft a coherent line of thought about something that, quite honestly, I'll never experience, and the feelings that follow that I'll never fully understand. With all that said, here's my take. These are just some of the images that have come out of the protests that have arisen since the 2 grand jury decisions in the past 2 weeks. What do they all have in common? It's a simple concept that we seem to have forgotten in American society, that law enforcement is supposed to protect people, not kill them. It may not be fair to paint all the folks who serve in law enforcement with that brush, but in less than a month, 2 people who've been killed by the police have seen their killers walk with no trial to weigh the facts of the case. If that happened to someone who killed a police officer, laws would get changed and quick. But it happened to unarmed black men. And the truth of the matter is, there isn't a lobbyist for unarmed black men out there whining and dining legislators to ensure protections for them. Protections that many of us just naturally assumed were written right there in the Constitution. America is a very different place for black men. It's a place where you can get pulled over for driving in a neighborhood. It's a place where you can't walk through a store without getting followed by security. It's a place where even the most accepting people often behave in a way that's different than if they were in the presence of a white guy. It's a place where black men aren't surprised by white cops killing black men. And that's the reality, and it's a tragedy. We live in a world of coded messages about black men, messages that ultimately lead to fear. And those messages are so pervasive in our media, our conversations, and our everyday life that we don't even recognize them for what they are. Pure, unabashed racism, even if we don't mean for them to be. I can't begin to imagine what it's like to be confronted with that reality. And I agree with folks who want major changes to our justice system. There's no question those things are long overdue. But those changes won't solve the injustice our society inflicts on black men and women daily. We can't legislate away people's feelings, their behavior, or the thousands of other ways that we inflict injustice on these people. It's going to take a lot more than new laws to change this. It's going to take a lot more than just demilitarizing the police to change this. It's going to take us, the people of this country, to recognize that we, all of us, are part of the problem. That what happened to these men and thousands of others throughout our history is a reflection of our values as a society. And while you or I or any other person may not have been the one that pulled the trigger or held that chokehold, you and I are the ones who turned our backs countless times before and said nothing when it happened to someone else. Because this isn't a new thing. It's been happening for decades in America. And decades of injustice are what the victims and their families have been dealing with all this time. If you don't see that as a nearly insurmountable burden, then you can't see past your rose-colored glasses. This is a struggle. It's an external struggle to right the long-standing wrongs in our society. And it's an internal struggle to reconcile within ourselves the complex emotions and preconceived notions we hold. To be honest, I've been struggling. I've been struggling with the anger that I feel about the death of these and countless others over the years. I've been struggling with the knowledge that there's no way I can even begin to know the half of it. And I've been struggling with my own personal reality, that trying to put that anger and that outrage in a box and analyzing it and intellectualizing it isn't as much my attempt to understand as it is a defense mechanism to rationalize these complicated feelings away, so that I, a white guy who isn't confronted with this reality on a daily basis, don't really have to deal with it. I've seen the problem, and it's me. And that's something white folks who've never had to deal with anything like what most black folks have to deal with on a daily basis need to start saying to themselves when they get self-righteous or whatever about what's happening right in front of our faces. That we're either actively or tacitly participating in. We do it so often we don't even see what we're doing. Our institutions, the media, friends, you name it, we're all involved. We're blind. We're blind to the role we play in maintaining this reality. Blind because we'll never be in a position to truly understand. Blind because it's convenient. This isn't white guilt. This is an admission of guilt. Because in the end, all of us are guilty. We're guilty of maintaining this status quo in one way or another. There's no simple way, no law, no pill that can reverse the decades of craftily coded messages we hear and have come to accept that ultimately empower this status quo. But we have to start somewhere to make a change. And that means recognizing our role and keeping it the way it is now. Because while it may seem like we've come so far, that doesn't mean we don't still have a long way to go. And it's going to take all of us to get there. That's my take. Thanks for watching this episode of The Steve Ross Show. Next time I'll have part 2 of my interview with Watkins. Until then, thanks for watching and be safe.